For this assignment, I'm going to be talking about the internment of Japanese Canadians. And there's 3 places around Winnipeg that I want to take us. So let's go.
Okay, so before we get to our first destination, I'll fill you guys in on some basic knowledge. So the word internment means the imprisonment of people, commonly in large groups, without charges or without intent to file charges. And this term is usually just used to describe enemy citizens in wartime. Internment in Canada was a wartime measure enacted under the War Measures Act in the name of national security. However, it drew from a long line of anti-Asian racism and discrimination. And 21,000 Japanese Canadians were taken from their homes on the West Coast without any charges or due process. So they were basically kidnapped from their homes. Okay, so our first stop, which is that plaque right there, is the Manitoba Japanese Student Exchange plaque. It commemorates the 10th anniversary of the Manitoba Japanese Student Exchange Program, which allows Japanese and Manitoban students the opportunity to learn about each other's cultures. I thought it was important to start here because this shows the positive history of Japanese Canadians, but it wasn't always like that, and it's important to know all of history. At the beginning of the 20th century, Japanese people began arriving in Canada in visible, though still small numbers, and they were not welcomed kindly. White people in British Columbia protested their presence through legal discrimination and acts of violence. In 1902, the British Council confirmed an earlier provincial law. It stated that Asians in British Columbia, whether they were British subjects or not, were not allowed to vote. A few short years later, in September 1907, anti-Asian protests in Vancouver erupted in a violent riot. White people marched through Chinese and Japanese neighborhoods, breaking windows and assaulting people. In response, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier's government negotiated a gentleman's agreement with Japanese officials. The gentleman's agreement limited immigration from Japan to 400 people per year. This amount was then reduced to only 150 people in 1928. So unlike now, Japanese culture was not accepted nor shared in Canada.
Okay, our second stop is a war monument. This monument was created to mark the 40th anniversary of the Hiroshima nuclear bombing. The plaque and the Peace Garden represent the need for peace among all people. We are here because it was during the war that the intense hate against Japanese people increased. As soon as the war started, Japanese people were immediately banned from enlisting to fight because the government believed if Japanese Canadians were called for military service, they would have a strong argument for voting rights. Not long after, in March 1941, Ottawa required all Japanese Canadians, whether they were British subjects or not, to register with the government. In effect, this declared Japanese Canadians to be enemy aliens. Canada wasn't officially involved in the war yet, but the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, brought the United States into the Second World War, which triggered war between Canada and Japan and unleashed even more hostility against Japanese Canadians. White farmers, merchants, and political leaders seized this opportunity for their own racist agenda. They accused Japanese Canadians of being spies, and they called for drastic action to protect the West Coast. Politicians and lobbyists in British Columbia began campaigning for the removal or confinement of Japanese Canadians. Political pressure from the West Coast, led by federal cabinet minister Ian Mackenzie, caused the government to act. On January 14, 1941, Prime Minister Mackenzie King ordered the removal of all adult males of Japanese descent from the West Coast. The government ordered that the men be sent to work in road labor camps, and then on February 19, 1942, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order that authorized the military to exclude all ethnic Japanese from the West Coast. And then a few days later, Prime Minister Mackenzie King announced all people of Japanese ancestry would be excluded from a 100-mile zone inland of the Pacific coast. This order led to the removal of about 2,100 Japanese Canadians from their homes. Around 77% were British subjects and 60% were Canadian-born. A new government agency, the British Columbia Security Commission, was created to run the removal operation. Able-bodied Japanese Canadian men were ordered to report to Vancouver. They were divided by sex and housed together on cots in a former women's building and in livestock barns. The Japanese Canadians fought back. They refused to show up for transportation to road labor camps and surrendered themselves, demanding internment as enemy aliens. But in the process, around 700 Japanese Canadian men were targeted as troublemakers and sent to a prisoner of war camp in Ontario. And by the late summer of 1942, all Japanese Canadians had been moved from the West Coast. Around 2,150 men were sent to work on road labor camps. Another 3,500 Japanese Canadians opted to sign contracts to work on sugar beet farms outside British Columbia. And 3,000 more Japanese Canadians were permitted to leave the coast in groups and settle in so-called self-supporting projects. 1,200 people were exiled to the Slocan Valley in BC. They were housed in largely abandoned mining towns or in a government-built camp. They lived in abandoned houses or in newly built shacks. The housing was quickly put together and did not protect against Canadian winter. Except for producing shelter, the government didn't provide the Japanese people with any financial assistance, no food or clothing, and no schooling for kids above the elementary level. And then, over 2 years later, the Canadian government pushed Japanese Canadians to resettle east of the Rocky Mountains. Prime Minister Mackenzie King issued a new order in council. It gave Japanese Canadians two options: resettle outside of British Columbia or sign up for a voluntary deportation to Japan once the war ended. The policy was designed to pressure Japanese Canadians into giving up their British status and leaving the country. The majority of Japanese Canadians agreed to move east of the Rockies, though they still faced legal restrictions. However, once the war ended in August 1945, Ottawa issued orders to deport the 100,000 people who didn't move, were deemed to have agreed to voluntary deportation. Almost 4,000 people were still shipped to Japan. Many had to wait for years before they could return. Meanwhile, the government maintained the wartime restrictions on Japanese Canadians. They were not allowed to return to the West Coast until April 1st, 1941. Our final stop today is the Peace Garden. We're here because the war is coming to an end and Japanese people are being set free. During the post-war years, Japanese people and their allies began fighting for compensation for their wartime treatment. Japanese Canadians were generally unable to recover much of their losses. The wartime treatment of Japanese Canadians remained a largely taboo subject throughout the years. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, though he expressed public regret for the wartime actions, remained opposed to compensation. In September 1988, an agreement was reached in Canada. The terms of the settlement included an official apology, a redress payment of $21,000 to each surviving individual affected by official policy, a community fund of $12 million, and funding for the Canadian Race Relations Foundation to support human rights projects. Nothing can make up for the terrible actions committed against innocent Japanese Canadians, but we can try to find peace.